History may not be as linear or as detached from today as we may think. The ideas and situations we observe in the past are much closer, maybe uncomfortably closer than we might realize. In today's discussion, we explore how concepts not exclusive to or originating from music deeply influence how music would be practiced and preserved, and specifically why this helped set the musical humanist movement of the Renaissance into motion. To understand what was instrumental in the eventual humanist approach to music making in the Renaissance, we have to look to a key turn in music making itself. One of the revolutionizing concepts that I refer to will be the practice of writing, more specifically the practice of writing music down, notation. Notation in music is a form dictated by function ever since its inception. Writing things down, however, is not an idea that came from music, but it became an incredibly valuable tool in art in its own right, since the first traceable examples of writing. But why notate music in the first place? Well, why else would we write things down? It had to be for the same reasons people began to write words and images down. Even if communicating orally worked just fine, there's a need to transfer and preserve these communications in a more permanent medium, for posterity, correspondence, culture, and identity. The written medium is also the grounds for creation and imagination, a critical point that we'll circle around to. The most notable point at which notation becomes a focus in Western music history begins in the 9th century with Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire. In order to create political and religious unification through the way the liturgy celebrated, a system of writing down the chants of the church was developed and implemented, which would be the neumes. But later at the start of the 11th century, Guido d'Arezzo develops a system of the staff with lines and intervals represented by spaces, which eventually replaces neumes and becomes the standard staff we're familiar with today. He also invented solfege. Thanks, Guido. Now, it goes without saying that it needs to be said that this is the pivotal development of the time in music notation. These developments would set the foundation for new growth in the compositional arena of music, giving musicians the tools to write down their ideas and explore the depths of this new water, allowing them to view music from a different scope, showing harmony and eventually rhythm in a totally new way. I believe that this is the spark that led to the flourishing of newer musical conventions and practices that cultivate innovation for the sake of expression. These innovations manifest in the likes of the ars moderna and ars subtilior, all the way to Monteverdi with seconda pratica, opera, chorale and tonality, and beyond. The initial descriptions of this phenomenon by Jean de Maurice in his Ars Nova Musica and Jacobus de Liège's Speculum Musicae are indicators of a written concrete acknowledgement of a change in style and practice of writing, veering from the then ars antiqua based on the divinely inspired idea of tempus perfectum towards the imperfect division of time, in favor of the ars nova developed by Philippe de Vitry, which Liège describes as more difficult, complex, and subtle because of the new rhythmic and polyphonic complexity. The term humanism as we use it describes the why behind these changes in style and philosophy in general, especially in the Renaissance with the idea of conception versus perception. In a quest for the truth in the literature behind why humanism came into play at all, I found many answers, some irrelevant and some that wouldn't fit even in a 20-minute video. In 2 readings, however, I found compelling thoughts on the subject which inspired my own thinking and conclusions on this topic. The first of the 2, Renaissance Humanism and Music by Gary Tomlinson, posits that humanism as it would seem is a highly debated term with many definitions depending on which scholar you ask. You can just imagine the joy of looking for the cause of something and no one can even agree on what that thing is. But if you ask Tomlinson, he'll probably make a connection to emancipation and the pursuit of autonomous selfhood. Part of Tomlinson's discussion does give some hope, however. He tells us that humanism as a term can be useful if seen as more of a scope rather than a dictionary-defined term. As he states, the remedy for the sprawling proliferation of Renaissance humanisms is not to constrain artificially and a priori the term's range of implication, but instead to plot ever more carefully the many situations in which appear cultural tendencies we might usefully term humanist. This ties into the next approach, which I found especially compelling, from Susan E. Babbitt's Humanism and Embodiment, Remarks on Cause and Effect. Babbitt takes us into a kaleidoscope of perspectives, ranging from Marxism, Christian scripture, and Eastern philosophy, of which I found to be the most relative was Buddhism, for how their philosophy and teachings pertain to the essence of the human experience. Babbitt refers to a Buddhist law of nature, anicca, which describes the impermanent or constantly changing scope of existence which everything experiences. It tells us nothing is forever. We're momentary blips in the grand scheme of time, but the experiences we live through and most importantly share in that time, along with our memories, are all we can really give. In Monteverdi's Cruda Amarilli, he uses lots of word painting, matching the music to the text by rising or falling when the text speaks of similar ideas, showing passion and intensity through volume, density, and dissonance, and fading away when mentioning silence. All things that musicians of the antiquated orientation weren't fans of, especially dissonance between bass and higher voices. But Monteverdi putting seconda pratica to work is a critical example because it shows the emancipated approach to music, which Tomlinson describes, to breaking away from the then old and suppressive rules of music in order to achieve the expression that was more fulfilling and faithful to the text that he wanted to convey, supporting Babbitt's references to the ever-changing nature of humanity, more specifically that nothing is safe from change, and that time and spirit will find a way to break through all conventions. This is all to say change is the only constant. We collectively will always be constantly changing in some way or another. Therefore, music will also constantly be changing. Even today, we're in the midst of a new breakthrough technology that could change our approach to music and art in a wild way, just as the 14th century musicians were back then.